Greetings, this is Amy Wentley with Chai Knuckles Knitting, and this is episode 2022-31, The Magic Loop. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to work the magic loop for working small circumference pieces in the round. So that means things like socks, sleeves, toys, mitten thumbs, anything that you can think of that's small and in the round. And to do this, you're going to need a 40-inch circular needle, and I'm going to be working a very small piece that's 12 stitches around. So follow me. So I started out, I cast on 12 stitches on my needle in just a normal fashion. You can cast on, if you were working a sock, for instance, you may have 60, okay? The first thing you do is you divide your stitches, and they're going to be divided between two needles. Now, in lots of cases, that's going to be in half. Half your stitches on one needle, half your stitches on the other needle. In some cases, in socks, for instance, at times when you'll be maybe working a heel, you would separate it into a third of the stitches on the front and 2/3 of the stitches on the back. Or if you had a certain sort of stitch pattern that was a certain number of stitches, that could be on one needle and the rest of the stitches on the other needle. But for the sake of this demo, we're going to separate the stitches in half. And what we do is we take the stitches we cast on and we bring them down to the middle of the cord. So you have it roughly halfway. And then you're going to count half your stitches. So I want to cut my tail here just so we don't get confused too much by that. So I'm going to count 2, 4, 6 stitches. That's half of my 12. And then I pinch the cord so that I can pull it out. And I now have half the stitches on one cord and half the stitches on the other. And I'm going to want to continue to pull this cord up until I get my stitches on both needles. I'm going to have 6 stitches on one needle and 6 stitches on the other needle. Okay? And then I'm going to want to orient my needles. I'm going to want to have one in front and one in back. And I want the one in back to have the working yarn coming off of it. If yours looks like this and your working yarn is coming out of the front, all you need to do is turn your stitches inside out like that, and your working yarn will now be coming from the back. And make sure that this connecting both of them isn't twisted, and you're good, and you have both stitches lined up like this. Now I'm going to zoom in to give you kind of a closer view of what's going on. I'll be zooming in and out throughout this. So this is my yarn coming out of the back needle, and this is my front needle. Now I want to join to work in the round, so I know the next stitch I want to work is this stitch on the front needle, because my working yarn is coming out of the back needle. So if I want to work off this needle, I need another needle to work with. And the other needle to work with is the back needle. So I'm actually going to pull that needle out and see how those stitches are staying on the cord. And I'm going to pull that out until I have a good amount of cord to work with here. Let me show you this far away again. So this is my loop of cord back here, and this is my cord with my needle attached here. So now it comes around and I can work with it. So I'm going to insert my needle as if to knit on the front stitch, and I'll zoom in a little bit for you again. And I want my working yarn to be hanging between the needles, between the cord and the front needle here. So it's hanging down, okay? To do a knit stitch, I want that to be hanging down in the middle there, and I want it to stay in the middle going to wrap around my needle, pull it through for a knit stitch. So that's my first stitch, and then I'm going to snug it just a little bit. Don't yank it hard, just snug it a little bit. Then I'm going to work the second stitch. The pattern I'm working is a knit 2, purl 2 pattern. So this is knit 2. I'm going to purl 2. And then I'm going to knit 2. And then I run out of stitches on that front needle. What was the front needle? So now this is empty. So what I want to do now is I want to take the cord back here that these stitches are hanging off of, and I want to pull on it until I can get the needle close to those stitches and then get those stitches on the needle. So when I start every row, I want to start with stitches on both of my needles, and then I want to orient things so that my needle with the working yarn coming out of it is the back needle. So there you go, that's the back needle. So far I've worked half of the first round. I have to work the other half now. And what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to put a marker on a stitch on this back half, just hanging off a stitch on the bottom here. And this lets me know that this is the second half of my round. So whenever I come up to stitches on this needle and see this, I know this is the second half of the round. I'm only halfway through. I need to finish this. So last time I did knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, and so now these two are going to be purl 2. So I need to purl this first stitch on the front needle. To do that, I need to use the back needle. Now make sure that your working yarn is hanging between the two needles. Okay? Pull the back needle out and bring it around to work again. Just as a reminder, this is what things are going to look like again. You've got a loop here and a loop here. Okay. So your yarn is hanging between the two needles. You're going to go to purl the front needle, and you're going to reach under the front needle to wrap the yarn around and purl. Then you snug it. And this is going to be purl 2, knit 2, and purl 2. And since I see my marker back here, I know this is the second part of my first round. So now I've run out of stitches. This needle is loose. I'm going to pull my cord to get that needle to come up to the stitches and pull it on. If you ever have trouble getting your stitches over the join, if you bring your needles close to one another, it makes it easier to pull them through. And then I want to reorient my needles again so that my working yarn is in the back. If you ever go to reorient your needles or pick them up after, letting them go for a while, and your working yarn's coming out of the front here, just turn your stitches inside out, and now it'll be coming from the back. Okay, so I'm going to start my second round. So you can inadvertently add a stitch between halves of the rounds if you're not careful about where your yarn is hanging. So I'm going to knit my next stitch. What I want to do, the right way to do it, is to have the yarn between both needles, just hanging there. I bring my needle around to knit, and I take that yarn from the middle here and wrap it around and pull it through. Okay. That's the correct way. I'm going to take this out. I'm going to show you the incorrect thing to do. If you had your yarn actually up and over the back cord there by accident and went to knit, you would end up adding an extra stitch on the back needle there. And I'm going to leave that there because I want to show you how to deal with it if you make that mistake. So remember, to knit, the yarn needs to be hanging between the two needles, and after you go to insert, you should be wrapping from between the two needles, not over or under. So that's knit 2. This is purl 2. This is knit 2. So then you can make another mistake if you're going from so I'm halfway through the second round here, and I'm pulling my stitches onto my back needle, and I'm turning and I'm reorienting. So you can make another kind of mistake here if you go to purl, and let's say I didn't have my yarn hanging down between the two needles, and I went to purl and I just wrapped the yarn and pulled it through, then I would also create an extra just mess. So that really wouldn't work. Another way that I could make a mistake is if I have my yarn hanging down and I go to knit and I take my yarn over the needle instead of from underneath the needle. If I went over the needle and did this, I would make an extra stitch. Okay. So you don't want to do that. So I know this is the second half of my round because I just saw my marker here. And when I come up to my last purl 2, I see I have an extra stitch. And that extra stitch was inadvertent. And all I need to do is just drop that off the needle because I can tell it's a yarn over. It's not a real stitch. It's not going to run. Now, it's not good to do that every round because this could end up being loose and ugly, but one time here and there, it's going to even out in blocking. Okay, and so I want to show you now very quickly how to bind off because that can just be a little bit confusing. So I've oriented my needles. I have my needle with the working yarn coming from the back needle. Hanging between the two needles, I come around and I'm going to knit the first stitch and then knit the second stitch, and then I will lift the first stitch over the second stitch. That's one stitch bound off. So I'm going to purl and then I'm going to lift the first stitch over the second stitch, and then I'm going to purl again. And I'm going to lift the first stitch over the second stitch. And then I'm going to knit. And I'm going to lift the first stitch over the second stitch. And then knit again and lift the first stitch over the second stitch. And then I am left with one stitch on this needle. So what you need to do now is pull your cord for your back needle and now get those stitches on that needle. So you're going to have one stitch on one needle and the rest of the stitches on the other. And so now I can take my one stitch that's on this needle and I can work the rest of the bind off where I knit a stitch and lift, purl a stitch and lift, purl a stitch up. Yep, sorry, it's knit a stitch and lift, knit a stitch and lift, and purl a stitch and lift and purl a stitch and lift. And then I can go ahead and just cut my yarn, pull the stitch through, and I am done. And it's a little tube. Somebody in one of my classes called it a Barbie cowl. So there you go. So that is the magic loop method of small circumference knitting. So please look out for future videos. See you soon. Bye-bye.